What drove Irma Grese, the young and infamous Beautiful Beast of Auschwitz, to commit acts of unimaginable cruelty, and what was hidden behind her porcelain beauty and chilling composure? From private fantasies of power and control to the terrifying rituals she enforced on prisoners, the truth behind her rise and fall reveals a side of history that textbooks rarely show. This is the story of fear, obsession, and the deadly allure of authority, seen through the darkest moments of a life cut tragically short. Stay with us, because the revelations that follow will shock and unsettle you. Seeds of darkness. In the soft hills of Breschen, where mornings smelled of wet soil and the slow rhythm of dairy farms, a child named Irma Grese grew under skies heavy with silence. Her parents were simple workers, their lives tied to routine and obedience, but the air around them was beginning to change. Radios whispered the name of Adolf Hitler like a prayer, and children who once sang folk songs now marched in step to nationalistic tunes. For young Irma, the boundaries between innocence and indoctrination blurred before she could understand what either meant. Every morning she walked past walls draped with propaganda posters showing perfect Aryan families smiling beneath the swastika. The world was telling her who to be: pure, loyal, unquestioning. Her father, Alfred Grese, despised the Nazi Party, calling them destroyers of decency. But defiance was dangerous, and he ruled his home with the same iron hand he used to condemn the Reich. His strict Christianity left no space for tenderness, only correction. When Irma's mother took her own life after discovering her husband's affair, the last light in Irma's small world flickered out. What remained was discipline without compassion. At school, Irma became a shadow among classmates who mocked her withdrawn nature and simple clothes. Lessons were no longer about arithmetic or literature. Teachers spoke of purity, race, and loyalty to the Führer. Every child was expected to salute the image of Hitler hanging at the front of the classroom. For those who hesitated, punishment came swiftly. The transformation of Germany's youth was absolute, and even those who resisted became molded by its structure. Irma's desire to please authority grew quietly, disguised as the wish to finally be seen. When she turned 14, failure in school and relentless bullying drove her to drop out. Her father's response was not comfort, but rage. He struck her, calling her weak, ungrateful, and foolish. With no future under his roof, Irma left to work on a nearby farm. The rhythm of manual labor gave her a sense of control, the first she had ever known. But solitude deepened the bitterness she carried. She began to see submission not as humiliation, but as a path to belonging. Somewhere deep inside, obedience started to feel like safety. In the following year, she took a job at a small retail shop in Leuken, where soldiers passed daily, their uniforms gleaming, their eyes forward, their presence commanding. Irma watched them with fascination. They were everything her life was not: disciplined, admired, and feared. The world rewarded those who followed orders, not those who questioned them. It was there, behind the counter, that her quiet admiration for authority turned into longing. The rise of the Third Reich offered young women like Irma a rare promise: purpose. Posters showed strong, beautiful female workers and nurses serving their nation. To a girl craving recognition, that image was intoxicating. When she applied to work at a sanatorium at 15, it was not just for employment. It was for acceptance into the order she had been taught to revere. Behind that decision hid the unspoken truth. She was already surrendering herself to the machinery of control that would one day make her infamous. As Breschen faded behind her and the train carried her toward the world of Nazi medicine, Irma could not have known that her search for belonging would turn into a lifelong addiction to power. What began as a need to obey would soon evolve into the will to dominate, and the girl who once trembled at her father's voice would one day make thousands tremble at hers. Could the cruelty she would later wield have already taken root in the silence of her youth? Stay with us as the mystery deepens. Apprenticeship in cruelty. The train that carried Irma Grese away from Breschen seemed to promise escape, yet it was steering her towards something far darker. When she arrived at the Hohenluchen sanatorium, the crisp smell of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the faint odor of fear that clung to its tiled corridors. The building stood like a fortress of healing on the outside, but behind its white walls, the philosophy of life and death was quietly rewritten by men in uniforms. Irma began her duties as a nurse's assistant, scrubbing instruments, changing linens, and serving meals to patients who looked at her with silent dread. The doctors she admired wore the SS insignia, and their conversations often drifted from treatment to experimentation. Karl Gebhardt, the senior physician, spoke of purity of the race as if it were medicine itself. Irma listened, her curiosity outweighing her discomfort. When she saw how even the most horrific procedures were justified in the name of duty, she began to absorb their language, clinical, detached, efficient. Each passing week hardened her. The first time she saw a patient strapped to a table for a sterilization experiment, she froze, but the nurses beside her continued without flinching. One whispered, "This is for Germany." It was a small sentence, but it became Irma's shield. She stopped asking questions. She stopped seeing faces. The line between obedience and cruelty grew thinner until it vanished entirely. When the war escalated, opportunities for advancement came to those willing to serve the Reich's expanding machinery. Irma's supervisors noticed her silence, her ability to follow orders without hesitation. That quality made her useful. But when her academic scores proved too low to qualify as a full nurse, she was dismissed to a dairy farm in Fürstenberg, a demotion that stung her pride. Yet even there, surrounded by the monotony of machinery and butter churns, she dreamed of the sanatorium's corridors and the authority she once glimpsed. She wanted back in. Her return to that world came through Ravensbrück, the only major concentration camp for women. To outsiders, it was a labor facility. To those inside, it was a factory of suffering. There, Irma arrived as a trainee overseer. The camp's commandant, Dorothea Binz, was a woman who ruled with terrifying precision. She taught Irma that compassion was weakness and hesitation was betrayal. The women under training were told that the inmates were not people but elements, a word meant to erase humanity. Irma's education became a ritual of desensitization. Each morning she joined drills that blurred discipline with degradation. She learned how to measure rations, record punishments, and enforce silence. At night, she witnessed the grotesque medical experiments performed on prisoners, shattered bones, infected wounds, and chemical tests that defied mercy. She stood by as bodies were dragged out, their pain treated as data. The memory of her mother's death flickered occasionally, but it no longer softened her. It only reminded her that weakness had no place in this world. By the time she reached 18, Irma had learned the art of survival through subjugation. Power, she discovered, gave her a thrill that replaced every feeling she had lost as a child. The once timid farm girl now looked into mirrors and saw an SS uniform, a symbol of belonging. She no longer flinched at screams. She no longer saw injustice, only order being maintained. When news came that a new post awaited her at Auschwitz-Birkenau, she felt not fear, but excitement. To her, it was a promotion, proof that she had become more than invisible. She was being sent to one of the Reich's most important camps, where obedience met destiny. The train waiting at the platform gleamed under the pale light, ready to carry her into the next chapter of her transformation, from servant to master, from witness to wielder of terror. But what happens when obedience turns into pleasure and duty becomes desire? Come with us to explore the hidden corners of the story. The Beautiful Beast of Auschwitz. The train hissed to a halt at Auschwitz-Birkenau, its brakes shrieking like an omen. As Irma stepped onto the platform, the air struck her, thick, metallic, alive with the smell of burning. Smoke drifted upward from chimneys that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. Around her, prisoners in striped uniforms shuffled silently under the barked orders of SS men. Dogs snarled, guards shouted, and the rhythm of death was already well practiced. Irma didn't flinch. To her, this was no nightmare. It was a stage, and she had finally been given her role. Her uniform was crisp, her boots polished to a mirror shine. She started with simple duties, manning the telephones, taking roll calls, carrying out small tasks under supervision. Yet even these early chores came with an intoxicating sense of control. When prisoners hesitated to answer, she raised her voice for the first time. The echo pleased her. The other guards noticed how swiftly she adapted, how easily authority fit her frame. It wasn't long before she was promoted to oversee small work details, watching over lines of women dragging carts of stone through the mud. Auschwitz had a way of swallowing humanity whole. For Irma, it became a place where her insecurities turned into confidence. Each order she gave erased another trace of the timid girl she once was. Her whip became her voice, her gaze a verdict. She studied the habits of senior officers, mimicking their tone, their posture, even their gestures of casual cruelty. She learned that fear commanded obedience faster than words ever could. But the camp was not only a factory of death, it was also a hierarchy of privilege. Irma discovered that beauty carried its own currency. Her blonde hair and clear eyes made her stand out among the other female guards. Senior SS men took notice, some with curiosity, others with lust. For the first time in her life, Irma held power not only over the prisoners, but over her superiors as well. Compliments from officers turned into invitations, and invitations into unspoken bargains. Her reputation began to spread quietly through the barracks, a woman who could punish with elegance and smile while doing it. She became known among prisoners as the angel-faced wolf. Her voice could shift from soft to sharp in seconds, her expression as unreadable as ice. Survivors later spoke of how she would watch selections for the gas chambers, standing slightly apart, her hands clasped behind her back, her face calm as people were chosen to die. She was meticulous, noting numbers, ensuring no mistakes were made. She had mastered the art of appearing efficient while erasing empathy altogether. As months passed, Irma rose to become one of the senior wardresses in Birkenau's female camp. Her section was overcrowded, thousands crammed into barracks built for hundreds. She enforced order with precision, inspecting uniforms, checking bunks, and administering punishment with her whip for even the smallest infraction. To her, it was structure. To the prisoners, it was terror made flesh. Outside the barracks, she often rode a bicycle, her whip coiled neatly at her belt, 2 trained dogs pacing beside her. The image of her cycling through the camp became a symbol of dread, beauty gliding through misery, smiling as she passed the condemned. Some prisoners swore she looked almost radiant, as if untouched by the filth and despair around her. That radiance became her armor. In the mirror of her quarters, she saw not a villain, but a woman thriving where others broke. Irma Grese had found her purpose, and it was terrifyingly clear. She no longer wanted to serve the Reich. She wanted to embody it. Every command, every scream, every trembling gaze that met hers confirmed it. The girl who once searched for belonging had finally become indispensable to the very system that destroyed others. How far could one rise in a world built on suffering before the illusion began to crack? Let us guide you into what no one expected. Masks, mirrors, and madness. The uniform was her armor, but behind it, Irma Grese wove a private fantasy world that few could imagine. She collected stolen silks and delicate fabrics, secretly enjoying the luxury that contrasted violently with the suffering around her. These garments were often crafted by Jewish prisoners she would later send to their deaths. Yet to Irma, the artistry became a perverse kind of trophy. In her mind, she was not just an SS guard, but a star performing on history's cruelest stage. Mirrors lined the corners of her barracks, reflecting a carefully constructed persona. Irma's reflection became a confidant, a silent witness to her ambitions and fears. She practiced expressions of charm, cruelty, and power in the glass, rehearsing the life she imagined beyond the war. Some survivors later recalled how she would whisper to herself, adjusting a ribbon or smoothing a dress, as though preparing for a premiere audience that would never arrive. Her relationships with men in authority were strategic performances. Joseph Mengele and other high-ranking officers were not companions in friendship, but instruments in her self-fashioned theatre. Their attention validated her illusions of grandeur, yet she wielded this influence like a weapon, using it to amplify her terror over prisoners. Grese's interactions were calculated, blending seduction and intimidation in ways that blurred the line between desire and domination. The selection of prisoners she spared revealed her warped criteria. Compassion rarely guided her. Rather, she chose individuals who resembled the characters she imagined in her private plays. A young woman with a particular gait, a man with a specific look. These glimpses of imagined beauty or power were preserved only for her own satisfaction. This selective cruelty cemented her as an unpredictable force, one whose whims were impossible to anticipate yet deadly to those caught in them. In solitary moments, cracks appeared in her constructed reality. Irma's diary entries, discovered after the war, suggested a mind both exhilarated and tormented by control. She wrote of feelings that oscillated between dominance and vulnerability, revealing the inner tension of someone addicted to power, yet haunted by the responsibilities it entailed. These glimpses into her psyche show not just a cruel guard, but a young woman wrestling with an identity forged in horror. Even within the camp hierarchy, Grese sought admiration. She trained her subordinates not just in discipline but in performance. Orders were given with a flourish, punishments executed with dramatic precision, creating an environment where fear and spectacle intertwined. Other SS women looked to her as both mentor and rival, drawn to her charisma while wary of her mercilessness. She was building not just fear but legend. Her obsession with mirrors extended to strategic intimidation. In corridors, she would pause to meet the eyes of a prisoner reflected from a window, creating the illusion of omnipresence. Some survivors recounted the unnerving sensation of being watched even when she was physically absent, a psychological terror that compounded the physical abuse. Grese's mastery of perception allowed her to manipulate both her image and the emotions of those around her with chilling efficiency. Irma's fantasies, however, were deeply intertwined with violence. Private accounts reveal her fascination with instruments of punishment. Whips, belts, and sticks were arranged not just for utility, but as symbols in her imagined stagecraft. She reportedly described her actions in camp as performances, moments when power and aesthetics collided, and the suffering of others became a backdrop to her self-created drama. These confessions paint a portrait of a young woman utterly consumed by the theatre of cruelty. Yet even as her world of masks and mirrors grew, reality threatened to pierce the illusion. The tides of war shifted, rumors of approaching defeat reached the camp, and whispers of accountability began circulating. Grese's private domain remained unchallenged for a time, but the first seeds of vulnerability were sown. Despite this, she continued her rituals of control, convinced that her narrative could outlast the collapse of the Reich itself. Is it possible for a young woman, captivated by both fantasy and fear, to endure the collapse of the very empire that raised her? Stay with us to know. Collapse of the monster. The chill of the approaching winter seemed to mirror the crumbling world around Irma Grese. As the Third Reich faltered, the illusions she had clung to in mirrors and silks began to shatter. Orders arrived with increasing desperation. Chaos replaced precision, and the once formidable camp structures collapsed under the pressure of starvation, disease, and relentless fear. Grese, still armed with her whip and razor-sharp authority, was forced to confront a reality that even her carefully constructed fantasies could not deny. Death marches became the new routine. Columns of prisoners shuffled through snow and mud, their emaciated bodies trembling, lungs burning with cold and exhaustion. Irma maintained the same ruthless discipline, Yet even eyewitnesses noted the first cracks in her composure. The terror that had once flowed naturally from her now required effort, an act she performed with meticulous calculation. Her laughter, once a spontaneous expression of cruelty, sometimes rang hollow, betraying the tension lurking beneath her polished exterior. Bergen-Belsen awaited as a landscape of ruin. The camp was no longer a place of order, but a landscape of decomposition. Corpses were stacked like firewood, typhus and dysentery ran rampant, and the stench of death clung to every surface. For many guards, horror began to surface, yet Greece seemed almost impervious, continuing her punishing routines with frightening zeal. Prisoners were forced to kneel in the snow or carry heavy stones until collapse, a theatre of suffering in which she starred as both director and audience. Behind the acts of cruelty, fear began to whisper in Irma's mind. Rumours of advancing British troops circulated through the camp, growing louder each day. While other officers considered fleeing, she did not. Perhaps it was arrogance, perhaps denial, but she remained, poised in a strange calm, a woman convinced that her constructed authority could survive the fall of the empire itself. She wore the uniform like armor, yet beneath it, tension hummed like an unacknowledged heartbeat. Prisoners later recounted the chilling duality of her presence. At times she would pause, observing the chaos with a detached curiosity, as though examining the camp as a scientist studies an experiment. Her methods of punishment evolved under stress. Small humiliations were amplified, and moments of terror were orchestrated to maximize psychological damage. It was as if her entire identity had fused with the machinery of fear, leaving no room for remorse, only efficiency. Even among fellow SS members, whispers of unease spread. Irma's youth, previously a source of fascination and envy, now seemed like a liability. Her impulsive cruelty contrasted with the increasingly erratic commands of senior officers, creating friction that would later factor into survivor testimonies. She had mastered terror, but now the empire of fear she relied upon began to tremble under the weight of its own collapse. The day British forces arrived marked the first confrontation with inevitable judgment. Soldiers found a camp that defied description, and Grese stood among the wreckage, whip in hand, face impassive. Witnesses described her calm as almost theatrical, a final performance in which she would not break character. When questioned, she justified every act as duty, maintaining a strict adherence to the logic of obedience even as the world around her fell into ruin. Yet the empire she had served with unwavering loyalty was no more. Her power, once absolute, evaporated in an instant, replaced by the harsh glare of justice that would follow. Prisoners, witnesses, and soldiers alike would later describe a sense of disbelief at the juxtaposition of her poise and the horror surrounding her. The Beautiful Beast of Auschwitz, feared and mythologized, now stood exposed, a human figure stripped of invincibility. What happens when someone so young, who once ruled through fear as both tool and shield, faces the shift from power to reckoning? Come with us to explore the hidden corners of the story. Schnell, the last command. The courtroom was silent, heavy with tension, as Irma Grese entered. Gone was the uniform of unquestioned authority. In its place, a plain prison garb emphasized her youth and small stature. Yet her presence remained magnetic, drawing attention like a dark star. Observers later recalled the paradox. A woman both fragile and fearsome, whose gaze held the weight of countless horrors. The stage was set for the final act in a life built around control, cruelty, and survival. Testimonies began with survivors recounting experiences that bordered on disbelief. Voices quivered as they described punishments executed with meticulous cruelty. Each story painted Grese not just as an agent of terror, but as a strategist of psychological warfare. Witnesses spoke of her selecting prisoners for humiliation based on whims, timing beatings to maximize fear, and orchestrating despair with the precision of a conductor directing a macabre symphony. Grese maintained a calm, almost detached demeanor as the accounts unfolded. She admitted to striking prisoners, yet insisted these were acts of compliance with orders, a soldier following protocol rather than a participant in atrocity. Defense attorneys cited age as a mitigating factor, yet the prosecution painted a portrait of calculated malevolence. Psychologists and observers noted her composure suggested a complex interplay between denial and pride. She seemed to inhabit two selves simultaneously, the obedient servant of the Reich and the self-fashioned icon of terror. Every gesture, every word, was measured to preserve the facade of control, a final performance in the public eye. For the first time, the consequences of her fantasies collided with reality. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed reports, photographs, and survivor testimonies converged into a narrative impossible to deny. Witnesses described not only physical punishment, but also psychological torment. Prisoners forced to witness executions, endure prolonged suffering, and live under constant fear. Each act was catalogued with precision, a testament to Grese's systematic cruelty. Even her youth, previously an attribute that inspired admiration, became a point of focus. The judges remarked on how a 22-year-old could possess such ruthlessness. Comparisons with older officers highlighted a chilling fact. Her cruelty was cultivated by ambition and opportunity rather than age. Her beauty, which had once seemed like a weapon, now contrasted starkly with the horrors she committed. The final days of the trial were marked by tension and anticipation. Prosecutors summarized the evidence. The defense struggled to craft a narrative. Grese remained poised, her expression unreadable, occasionally glancing toward the gallows that awaited her. She had built her identity around control, and now every aspect was being dissected, weighed, and condemned. On December 13, 1945, the sentence was carried out. Irma Grese, the Beautiful Beast of Auschwitz, walked to the gallows under British supervision. Her steps were measured, her posture erect, the final display of the control she had wielded so carefully throughout her life. The executioner later recounted her whispering a single word before the trapdoor opened. Schnell, a command that had become synonymous with speed, obedience, and the authority she had so desperately clung to. In that moment, all illusion vanished. The fantasy of omnipotence, the mirrors, the silks, and the carefully curated fear collapsed into silence. Irma Grese's life ended with a single echo of command, leaving behind a legacy of terror, fascination, and disbelief. The empire she had served, the identity she had crafted, and the power she had wielded ceased to exist in an instant, leaving only a stark reminder of how a young life could become entwined with history's darkest chapters. Were you disturbed by the secrets of Irma Grese and the terrifying reality of how a young woman became one of history's most infamous figures? Share your thoughts below.